It was 1:47 a.m. on a Friday night, somewhere along a dark stretch of railroad tracks between Chicago and upstate New York. The sleeper compartment was tiny, 2 narrow bunks, amber reading lights, and the steady, rhythmic clatter of steel against rail. Grace was sitting on the lower mattress, her knees pulled to her chest, spinning the thin silver bangle on her wrist. I was sitting on the fold-down seat opposite her, barely 3 feet away. She looked at me through the dim light, her hazel eyes completely serious. "Can I ask you something weird, Miles?" "Your standards for weird are historically alarming," I replied softly. "Go ahead." Grace took a slow breath. "What if we've been in love all along?" I froze, the air leaving my lungs. "What?" "Think about it," she whispered. 11 years. We call each other first. You have a drawer at my place. What if we've just been very good at calling it something safer?" I looked at the woman I had spent 4 years silently loving. And the terrifying truth was, I didn't need to guess the answer. I had known it for years. My name is Miles Donovan. I am 31 years old, and I work as a theatrical set designer and scenic carpenter in Chicago. I make a living building temporary worlds out of wood, steel, and canvas. I know how to construct load-bearing walls, reinforce sagging platforms, and solve physical problems with a tape measure and a drill. But when it came to my own personal life, I was a coward who hid behind an unyielding philosophy. If something works, never put a label on it that might break it. Grace Holloway and I met 11 years ago during our senior year of college. I was walking past an open studio in the Visual Arts Hall when I saw a girl furiously trying to balance a precarious cardboard exhibition model on an uneven wooden easel. "That shelf is going to collapse in about 10 seconds, I had observed from the doorway. She turned around, paintbrush in hand, and glared at me. "Hello to you too. Just trying to save lives," I said. "It's cardboard, genius. Tiny cardboard lives matter, Holloway." I walked in, grabbed a spare wood shim from my back pocket, leveled her easel, and secured the joint. We went for cheap diner burgers afterward, and from that night on we became an undeniable constant in each other's lives. Over 11 years, Grace became the center of my universe. She was a museum registrar now, managing high-stakes art shipments, exhibit logistics, and museum collections. In her professional life, she was meticulous and hyper-organized. In her personal life, she constantly lost her car keys, left hair ties in my truck, and drank half a cup of coffee before forgetting where she placed the mug. I helped Grace move apartments 4 times. She was the first person to read my design proposals. She was my emergency contact on every medical form, and I was hers. I kept a dedicated coffee mug in her kitchen cabinet, and she had a permanent drawer in my dresser. Whenever our friend group teased us about our synchronized domesticity, we had a rehearsed routine. "You two have been married since 2015, our friend Mason would joke. "You just forgot to file the paperwork." "Paperwork ruins perfectly good friendships, Mason," I would reply smoothly. "And he's completely unmanageable," Grace would add on cue. It was our armor. Underneath my relaxed sarcasm lay a deep, structural fear. When I was 26, I dated Natalie. She was a wonderful woman, but our relationship quickly turned into an exhaustive checklist of 5-year milestones. She wanted a corporate office career for me, a suburban condo, and a rigid timeline. When I refused to give up my independent carpentry studio, the relationship dissolved into quiet resentment. I walked away convinced of one dangerous law. The moment you label a relationship, expectations start redesigning it. Grace had her own hidden scars. 3 years ago, she had been engaged to Andrew, but as the wedding approached, Andrew grew distant and hesitant, eventually admitting he loved her but wasn't sure about building a lifetime together. The breakup devastated her because it proved that being loved didn't mean being chosen. Grace lived by her own strict rule. Never beg someone to be sure about you. And for 4 years, I had been completely, hopelessly in love with her. The sequence of events that trapped us in a sleeper compartment began 10 hours earlier at O'Hare International Airport. Our college friends, Mason and Lily, were getting married in a rustic lakeside venue in upstate New York. Grace and I had booked an afternoon flight out of Chicago, intending to arrive in time for the rehearsal dinner. We were standing at the departure gate at 3 p.m. when the display board flashed bright red. Flight canceled. Mechanical maintenance. There was no storm. There was no bad weather. The Boeing 737 simply had a hydraulic pump failure, and because of a regional airline convention that weekend, every subsequent commercial flight out of Chicago to New York was fully booked until Saturday afternoon. "We're going to miss the rehearsal dinner," Grace said, staring at the gate agent's counter in despair. "We won't miss the actual wedding," I replied, pulling out my phone. "Optimism looks profoundly unnatural on your face, Miles." "I am a man of logistics," I noted, scrolling rapidly through transit options. I found a late afternoon overnight train route departing Union Station at 5:15 p.m. that would arrive at the lakeside town by 8:30 a.m. the next morning. There was only one booking left on the entire train. A single, private sleeper compartment with upper and lower berths. "One compartment," I told her, looking up from my screen. "2 bunks. It's about the size of a walk-in pantry." "Book it," Grace ordered without hesitation. "I am not missing Lily walking down the aisle because of a broken airplane pump." By 5:30 p.m., we were rolling eastbound out of Chicago. The sleeper cabin was remarkably compact. 2 narrow fold-down bunks lined the right wall. A tiny fold-out table sat under the window, and there was barely 18 inches of walking space between the bunks and the sliding hallway door. At 7 p.m., we headed to the train's dining car for dinner. The car was warm and bustling with older couples and weekend travelers. An elderly woman seated at the adjacent table smiled warmly at us as Grace automatically reached across the table, took my plate, and cut my overcooked steak with her fork while I poured her mineral water. "How long have you two been married?" the woman asked pleasantly. "We're not married," I answered instantly. 11 years, Grace said at the exact same moment. Grace blinked, realizing she had answered the wrong question. A heavy flush crept up her neck. "Friends," Grace quickly corrected, her voice tight. 11 years as friends. The elderly woman's husband chuckled over his coffee. "Careful, young man. Sometimes those are the dangerous ones." The rest of dinner was swallowed by an unusual, quiet electricity. When we returned to our compartment around 9 p.m., the train's Wi-Fi signal completely dropped as we entered the rural hills of Indiana. Grace tried to work on her laptop, but with no internet connection, she eventually closed the lid with a frustrated sigh. I set my paperback novel on the windowsill. For the first time in months, there were no work emergencies, no mutual friends, and no domestic routines to hide behind. There was only the steady hum of the train engine, the dark forest rushing past the window, and 36 inches of space between us. Grace reached into her tote bag, pulled out a dark chocolate bar, broke it in half, and handed me the larger piece. "You skipped dessert?" she murmured, looking down at the wrapper. "You hate sharing chocolate," I pointed out softly. "I have eyes, Miles," she whispered. "I notice things." Around 11:30 p.m., the train plunged deeper into the dark countryside, the compartment bathed in the low amber glow of the small reading lamp. Grace was sitting with her back against the wall, tracing a finger along the seam of her jeans. "Have you ever wondered what would happen if we actually tried dating?" she asked casually. I let out a dry, quiet chuckle, leaning my elbows on my knees. "Disaster. Complete and total catastrophe." Grace raised an eyebrow. That was an aggressively fast answer. "You steal blankets," I stated. "You have literally never slept beside me, Miles." I paused, caught off guard. "You stole a wool blanket in my truck during a road trip to Michigan 3 years ago." "A tactical recovery," she corrected smoothly. "What else would we fight about?" "Your calendar," I answered without hesitation. "Your complete and utter obsession with arriving everywhere 35 minutes before human beings are supposed to exist. That is called respecting the concept of time, Miles. That is called clinical anxiety with a wristwatch," I teased. "What else?" she pushed, a small smirk playing on her lips. "You would reorganize my workshop kitchen," I noted. You'd put labels on my spice rack and arrange my coffee mugs by color. Your workshop kitchen requires immediate federal intervention, Miles. See, I smiled. Irreconcilable differences. Grace looked at me, her smile softening into something far more contemplative. Sounds manageable to me. My chest tightened, the air suddenly turning thick. Why did you hate Andrew so much? Grace asked quietly, shifting the conversation into dangerous territory. I didn't hate Andrew, I lied. You referred to him as human khakis for 18 months, Miles. He wore an unnecessary amount of beige, I defended. You hated him from the day I introduced you. I hated him, I said, my voice dropping all pretense of humor. Because I didn't think he understood how lucky he was. The sentence slipped out before my brain could stop it. The compartment fell into a dead, breathless silence. Grace went completely still, her hazel eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse spike. As your friend, I quickly added, clearing my throat and looking at the window. I meant as your friend. Of course, she whispered, looking down at her silver bangle. I cleared my throat, desperate to pull us out of the emotional quicksand. What about Natalie? You weren't exactly her biggest fan either. Natalie rearranged your bookshelf by spine color, Grace said defensively. That was objectively psychopathic. It was visually organized. No, Miles, Grace said softly, looking back up at me. She spent 14 months talking about the man you could become if you just gave up your studio. I hated her because she made my best friend feel small. Her words sliced straight through my ribs. I stared at her, completely stripped of my usual sarcastic retorts. Why are you still single, Grace? I asked quietly. Because I'm done being somebody's maybe, she answered without hesitation. I spent 3 years wondering if Andrew was ever going to wake up and decide I was worth building a life around. I would rather be alone on a sleeper train than ever spend another year wondering if I am enough. You were always enough, I whispered fiercely. Grace looked at me for a long, quiet beat, her throat moving as she swallowed. To break the crushing tension, Grace opened her phone gallery to pull up old college photos for the wedding slideshow. As she scrolled, I noticed hundreds of photos of me spanning the last decade. Photos of me covered in sawdust at my workshop, photos of me driving my truck, candid pictures of me asleep on her living room sofa during a blizzard 4 years ago. Why do you have so many terrible candid pictures of me? I asked, pointing at the screen. Documentation, she claimed. This looks like federal surveillance. You looked peaceful, she admitted softly, staring at the photo of me on her sofa. You spend all your time fixing things for everyone else. It was nice seeing you rest. Around 1:30 a.m., we decided to attempt sleep. I climbed the small ladder to the upper berth, while Grace lay on the bottom bunk. I stared at the white vinyl ceiling panel 6 inches from my nose. The rhythmic sway of the train did nothing to calm the adrenaline pounding in my veins. Miles? Grace's voice drifted up through the quiet dark. Yeah. Do you ever think about how strange we are? Every single day. I'm serious, she whispered. Come down here. I climbed down the wooden ladder and sat on the edge of the lower berth, our knees barely an inch apart in the dark. And that was when Grace looked into my eyes and delivered the question that shattered 11 years of carefully guarded safety. What if we've been in love all along? Grace, I breathed, my throat tight. You keep listing reasons why we're just friends, she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. Like they're evidence against the fact that we've spent 11 years choosing each other over everyone else. Before I could answer, a loud, sharp vibration buzzed across the small fold-out table beneath the window. Grace's phone screen lit up in the dark compartment. A scheduled calendar notification flashed across the display in bold black text. San Diego Fellowship. Final decision due today at 4 p.m. I stared at the bright screen, the letters burning into my retinas. San Diego? I asked, my voice flat with shock. Grace looked away, pulling her knees tighter against her chest as a heavy flush rose up her neck. I was going to tell you, When, Grace? I asked, gesturing to the cramped cabin. Sometime between the rehearsal dinner and the reception? I got the formal offer 2 days ago, she admitted quietly, her voice trembling. It's an 11-month senior exhibition registrar fellowship at the San Diego Museum of Art. It starts in 5 weeks. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. That's why you asked me that question. Yes, she confessed, looking up at me with tears finally spilling past her lashes. Because if you don't feel the same way, Miles, I need to take this fellowship. I need to leave Chicago, and I need to stop building my entire life around a man who has no idea I'm doing it. Building your life around me? I repeated, my voice cracking. I picked an apartment 12 minutes from your workshop, Miles, she cried out softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. I keep my weekends open because I know that's when you finish your builds. Every time something good happens, you are the first person I call. When I think about home, I don't picture a building. I picture you standing in your woodshop with sawdust in your hair. She took a shaky, ragged breath, looking directly into my eyes. I fell in love with you 3 years ago, Miles, she whispered. The night Andrew left, when you showed up at my door with groceries and a spare key and didn't ask me to explain a single thing. I waited for you to say something, but you stayed silent. And after 3 years, your silence started feeling like an answer. Her words completely dismantled my defensive armor. My silence wasn't an answer, Grace, I said, my voice breaking with raw emotion as I reached out, my hands trembling as I gently took hers. My silence was fear. Fear of what? Fear of losing you, I confessed, the dam finally breaking inside my chest. 4 years ago, you came to my shop after a terrible day at the museum. You sat in that old oak chair for 2 hours reading a book, and we barely said 3 words. When you left, I realized I wanted you sitting in my quiet spaces for the rest of my life. But I saw what happened with Natalie. I saw what happened when people put labels on love and destroyed the foundation. I convinced myself that keeping you as my best friend was the only way to guarantee I would never lose you. Grace let out a soft, shuddering sob. Miles. Refusing to start something because it might end is still a way of losing it. I looked at the woman who had held my entire world together for over a decade. Maybe we didn't fall in love tonight, Grace, I whispered, reaching up to cup her cheek, my thumb gently wiping away her tears. Maybe tonight is just when we finally ran out of excuses for what we've been doing for years. Grace looked up at me, her breath hitching in her throat. Are you going to kiss me, Miles Donovan? Or are you going to analyze the structural integrity of this train? I'm 4 years late, I whispered. I leaned down and kissed her. It was deep, warm, and steady. An emotional release of 11 years of hidden longing, shared coffee cups, and unyielding devotion. Grace wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, pulling me close until there was 0 distance left between us in the narrow berth. When we finally parted, resting our foreheads together in the quiet amber light of the cabin, Grace let out a long, shuddering breath. Then her eyes drifted toward her phone on the table. San Diego is still due at 4 p.m., she whispered. The train arrived at the small lakeside station at 8:15 a.m. on Saturday morning. We had exactly 7 hours and 45 minutes before Grace's 4 p.m. deadline. As we walked along the gravel path toward the wedding venue's guest lodge, my old, conditioned instincts immediately flared up, the protective impulse to step back and play the martyr. You should take the fellowship, Grace, I said, keeping my voice carefully measured. It's an 11-month senior leadership role. It's the exact career leap you've been working toward for 5 years. Grace stopped dead in her tracks on the stone walkway, turning to face me with a look of sharp, profound disappointment. Of course, she said, letting out a bitter, humorless laugh. I tell you I love you in a train car, we kiss, and 5 hours later you are already packing my suitcase for me. I am trying to support your career, Grace, I argued, running a hand through my hair. I am not going to be the selfish guy who asks you to throw away a dream opportunity just because we finally admitted our feelings. There is a massive difference between asking me to throw away an opportunity and letting me know you are one of the choices, Miles. She fired back, her hazel eyes blazing. Stop deciding what is best for me, so you can protect yourself from the discomfort of wanting me. Tell me what you actually want, and then trust me enough to make my own decision. Her words shattered my defensive retreat. She was completely right. I was trying to manage the situation to avoid the messy vulnerability of a long-distance relationship. I want you in Chicago, Grace, I said, stepping closer until our boots touched on the gravel. I want Sunday morning coffee with you. I want you barging into my workshop. I want to see what us looks like without hiding behind friendship. And, I added softly, I also know how much San Diego means to you. Both of those things are true at the exact same time. Grace's expression softened, the anger melting away into a quiet, beautiful smile. Thank you. That's all I needed to hear. At 1 p.m., we sat side by side in the second row of the outdoor chapel as Mason and Lily exchanged their vows. During the ceremony, Mason looked at Lily and said, I don't promise that our plans will never change. I just promise that you will never be the last person to know when they do. Grace turned her head, catching my eye in the bright afternoon sunlight. We held each other's gaze, the meaning of the vows echoing deeply in both of our chests. At 2:30 p.m., after the ceremony concluded, Grace and I walked out to a quiet stone terrace overlooking the lake. It was 3:30 p.m. We had 30 minutes left. I want the San Diego Fellowship, Miles, Grace said honestly, looking out over the water. And I want us. Then we don't choose between them, I said firmly, pulling out my phone's project schedule. We build a plan for both. We sat together on the stone bench and mapped out a practical strategy. The routine. My scenic carpentry projects in Chicago operated in concentrated 4-week build cycles followed by 2 weeks of design drafting. I committed to batching my shop builds, allowing me to fly to San Diego for 10 days every 6 weeks, working remotely on architectural CAD schematics from her apartment. The shared travel. Grace had scheduled exhibition intermissions every 3 months, during which she would return home to Chicago. At the communication rules, we established 3 fixed video call nights per week, with a strict rule that neither of us was allowed to say, I'm fine, when we were overwhelmed or lonely. The reality check. After 3 months, we agreed to sit down in person and honestly evaluate if the distance was working, promising to speak the raw truth without fear. At 3:42 p.m., 18 minutes before her deadline, Grace opened her laptop on the terrace table. She looked up at me, taking my hand. Still want this, Miles? I squeezed her fingers tightly, looking into her eyes. Take the job, Grace, and take us with you. Grace smiled, locked eyes with me, and clicked accept offer. 15 months later, the 11-month San Diego Fellowship officially concluded. Those 11 months of long distance were far from an effortless romantic montage. Long-distance love is demanding and unglamorous. There were delayed cross-country flights, time zone mix-ups, and weeks when my workshop deadlines or Grace's museum installations left us too exhausted to do anything more than text, I love you, before falling asleep. We had real arguments, like when I fell back into my old habit of sending detached, one-word texts instead of admitting I missed her, or when Grace felt overwhelmed by museum politics and tried to carry the burden alone. But this time, neither of us ran away. We stayed on the phone, worked through the discomfort, and kept every promise we made on that lakeside terrace. When the fellowship ended, Grace leveraged her success to secure a prestigious senior registrar position at a major cultural institution back home in Chicago. 3 months after her return, Grace officially moved her belongings into my timber loft apartment. On a quiet Sunday evening, we were sitting on the living room floor surrounded by unpacked cardboard boxes. Grace opened a wooden dresser drawer, the same drawer she had used as a guest for 6 years, and began filling the entire wardrobe. You know, I teased, handing her a stack of sweaters. This used to be just one drawer. Inflation, she replied effortlessly, hanging her jacket next to mine. That is objectively not how inflation works, Holloway. You're a carpenter, Miles, not an economist. Grace reached into a small keepsake box and pulled out a photograph. A candid selfie we had taken in the dim amber light of the sleeper train 15 months ago. She looked at the photo, then looked up at me with a mischievous spark in her hazel eyes. "Can I ask you something weird?" I smiled, sitting beside her on the rug and pulling her into my arms. "Apparently, that's how all our best decisions start. What if we've been in love all along?" she whispered softly. I leaned down, resting my forehead against hers, my fingers intertwining with hers. "Then we were just very slow at admitting it," I murmured against her lips. Looking back over those 11 years, I realized that what almost cost me the love of my life wasn't the fear of a failed romance or the distance of a career opportunity. It was the belief that keeping things safe behind quiet friendship was better than risking everything to build a real future. True love doesn't mean hiding behind comfortable boundaries. Mature love is about stepping across the line, speaking the truth, and choosing to build a life together, no matter how far the tracks may lead. If your best friend looked you in the eye and asked if you had been in love all along, would you have the courage to tell the truth, or would you stay silent to keep things safe? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.